Well, definitely there are elements of both. There have been areas in which they've collaborated, and in fact, quite recently, we saw it in Copenhagen, for example, on climate change. We've seen it at the World Trade Organization. There are definitely areas where it makes sense for India and China to work together. But I think that primarily that there is a competitive streak to the relationship, and that's kind of unavoidable. They compete on issues like resources. They share water resources. They compete on hydrocarbons and oil fields, for example, all over the world. And ultimately, when it comes to the West, there's also a kind of competition because for many Western countries, India is really the perfect counterbalance to China. And so we've seen very much over the last few years an attempt to kind of woo India into the Western orbit so as to balance China out, which is something that reinforces some of the rivalry and tensions between the two. I think when it comes to India, there is a tendency to overestimate. There's definitely a sense of wishful thinking when it comes to looking at India's rise. And part of it actually comes from this desire to balance China out. So there is a kind of boosting up of India over and beyond its present capabilities. It's very much, we're looking at the sort of potential of India in the long term. Whereas China is in a very different position. I mean, hyphenating China and India is a complicated issue. And I think Chinese themselves don't appreciate it very much because they see themselves at a very different level to India, whether you're looking at it in economic terms, whether you're looking at it in social terms, whether you're looking at it in geostrategic and actual power, in hard power terms. China is far ahead of India in almost every parameter that you would look at. But there is a tendency to club them together, and this is something that's really been a Western tendency. It's come from the West. And I think it's very much come from the desire not to have China emerge as this great sole superpower, because India is seen a little bit like us within our value system, whereas China is seen as much more threatening in many ways. So I think when it comes to China, there isn't a tendency to overestimate. I think there's a realistic assessment of their power, which is very much on the increase, particularly after 2008 and the sort of the change in the economic balance that we've seen in the world. But I think when it comes to India, there is definitely at the moment an overestimation. India really continues to be pockets of India are far poorer than sub-Saharan Africa, and if you look at human development indicators like education, maternal mortality, and so on, they're as bad as the poorest parts of Africa. And this is something that gets lost when you are talking about India as a big economic superpower. I think India, when it comes to China foreign policy, India gets it wrong quite consistently. I mean, on the one hand, India has a bit of a China pathology. They're obsessed with China. But this obsession tends to swing between pride and prejudice. It swings between either extreme envy and admiration, and which is not based on a nuanced understanding of what's actually happening in China, or it swings to paranoia and great fear that the Chinese are going to come and take us over, which is also not based on a very sophisticated understanding of China. We have very few Indian foreign policy experts. I mean, the experts we have hardly ever been to China. Most of them don't speak Chinese, and Indian foreign policy as a whole is not very strategic. It tends to be quite piecemeal. This is changing as India becomes more of a global strategic player, and as its relationship with China deepens, which it is, because it's becoming more multi-pronged than it was once upon a time. It's changing, but we still have a long way to go.